Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Standard Taxonomy of Peer Review. Thank you for joining, everyone. This is going to be a short webinar, hopefully not longer than 45 minutes, and we will quickly introduce the work we've done, and we will then answer your questions that you will kindly are asked to put in the chat box at the end. My name is Bahar Mehmani. I'm Reviewer Experience Lead at Elsevier and the host of the session. With me today, we have Louis Jones, Peer Review Manager at American Psychological Association, and Joris van Rossum, Director at the International Association of STM Publishers and Project Leader of this initiative. We will introduce the taxonomy of peer review, the document that Louis, Joris, myself, and other experts, including Maria Kowalczuk from Springer, Sabina Alam from Taylor and Francis, Carleen Black from Cambridge University Press, Elizabeth Moylan from Wiley, Tiago Barros from back then in Publons and now in F1000 have put together. Joris, tell us a little bit more about this project and the main drives behind it.
Yes, thank you, Bahar. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So in the last years, we've seen the emergence of a lot of innovative new review models, so-called open review models. That's of course a great thing, but at the same time, the definitions and the terminology is not often clear. So open review can mean many, many different things. In other words, there is the need to standardize the way we talk about peer review, but also we need to be transparent about what we mean by the different models. Another big driver for this initiative is the move towards open science and transparency. And the transparency, of course, also very much related to the peer review process, which, as we all know, is a very crucial process in science and scholarly communication. For these reasons, STM, the International Association for Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers, started a project to create a standard taxonomy of peer review processes. And the use of a standard taxonomy of peer review will make the peer review process more transparent, but also will allow the community, researchers, and authors to compare the different models across the different journals.
Absolutely. Louis, you're part of this group. How did you get involved and what was your experience within this group?
Yeah, so I've worked at the American Psychological Association within peer review for over 8 years, and I'm a big fan of transparency and just like helping authors understand what's going on. So I was really interested when I heard that this group was starting up. I think that it's really easy to think that when we all use the same word or phrase that we mean the same thing. And I think even when we started talking within the group, we were like, oh, well, this is what this means. And we found out very quickly that's not the case. And so I think having a shared vocabulary early on for very simple things like, well, what we think is simple makes it a lot easier as we go down the road to more and more open peer review. So it's just, I like the idea of helping people just understand and having that shared vocabulary.
Right. Of course, peer review has different meanings for different communities, and we only talked about peer review models in this taxonomy document. But Joris, the scope of this document. So STM Association also has book publishers and funding agencies as its members. Is this taxonomy document meant for those products and peer review processing those products?
Yeah, let me start by saying that what we're going to present today is a first draft. And this presentation kicks off the public consultation phase. So we very much invite the community to provide feedback on this draft. At the same time, this draft was not just created by all the members of the working group. We had very, very good collaboration with many organizations. We worked with the last few months, for example, EASE, PRE, ASAP Bio, COPE, Responsible Journals.org. We also discussed with many individuals in this area, for example, Tony Ross Hellauer. So this work also builds further on projects that have been done before. For example, the transparency in standards of practice and peer review that was started in 2018. Going back to your question, yes, of course, peer review is being applied to different objects, data, books, grant proposals. However, the scope of this taxonomy is for journal articles only, and there are two reasons for that. First of all, if we're successful here, then we feel it's easier to expand the taxonomy to other objects, such as books and grants. The second reason is because we feel the need is the highest here. Most innovative models are being applied to journal articles, so we want to first bring clarity here in this area, and later on expand to other objects at a later phase. So this is just the start.
That's absolutely clear. Louis, do you think there are other items that one should not expect from this document at this moment?
Yes, so our goal with this was to cover about 98% of the different peer review models. We talked about additional ones, specific ones, and also just things in general, but there were some that were so specialized, we were worried that we would kind of get lost in all of the differences. So this is to cover the majority of the journals that are out there. We also discussed at length and decided to exclude scope of review because this is very journal dependent. And even within creating a taxonomy, if you say, oh, this journal is focused on novelty, or this journal specifically wants just sound science, even if it's replications, that's not really applicable across all journals and fields the same way. So instead of including that in the taxonomy, we are strongly encouraging that all journals communicate that very specifically to authors through their instructions. And a third thing we're not including is we don't have visual markers at this time. It might be included at a later date, but it just seems like a smarter idea to just start with the taxonomy instead of visuals.
Right, absolutely. So talking about taxonomy all the time, maybe it's a good moment to also mention what is this taxonomy about? Well, the document itself describes the different review models in 4 elements of peer review process. So we thought we could basically map out the peer review process from submission of the manuscript as a starting point and go all the way through the decision making and upon publication, maybe afterwards post-publication peer review. So we've created 4 pillars, which will include identity transparency, who the reviewer interacts with, what information about the review process is published, and whether the post-publication community takes place. So throughout this webinar, we're going to go through each of these 4 pillars and explain how those consist of different elements. So Louis, maybe you can start explaining the identity transparency.
Sure. So this is going to be probably the most familiar part to everyone. It's basically, this is a list of the options for whose identity is known throughout the peer review process. So double blind and single blind, I think, are probably the most common. That's just in single, the author doesn't know the reviewer identities, but the reviewers know who the authors are. In double, the reviewer and author identities are both unknown to each other. Triple is that, but in addition, the editor who is actually making the decision doesn't know the reviewer or author identities either. Visible is basically everyone knows who everybody is. So this is pretty straightforward. Important to note that this is during peer review. This doesn't actually mean anything like during the publication process. Right.
And then the second pillar was about who reviewer interacts with. Joris, can you tell us more about this classification? What are other stakeholders in this peer review process that the reviewer needs to interact with?
Yeah, we talked about new review models that emerged the last years, and what we've seen, for example, is that their interaction between the editors, between the authors, and the reviewer changes. There are forms, in other words, of more collaborative, more interactive forms of peer review. And we describe those models by means of looking who the reviewer interacts with. So the traditional model, it's quite straightforward. The reviewer interacts with the editor. He or she is being invited and sends his or her report to the editor. But there are also models whereby the editor, the reviewers work together. And in some cases make a joint decision or recommendation to the editor. So that is described by the reviewer interacts with editor and other reviewers. There are also models whereby the author and editors collaborate in the review process, and there are models where the editor, the reviewers, and the authors all work together in a collaborative effort. So this column describes those different interactive models of peer review.
Great. So then the third category is about reviewer information published. And I think this is the most confusing part, particularly when we talk about open peer review. Also, we heard at the beginning of the session the need for disambiguation on that particular peer review model. So Luis, can you help us to understand how this third category is explaining different types and characteristics?
Yeah, definitely. So this is definitely the one that has the most options and is a lot newer than the other categories. So none is, that just means pretty much the traditional peer review process where the article's published, but none of the reviewer content or editorial decision making is published. A lot of journals still function like this. It's kind of the classic model. So that I think was pretty well agreed upon. It's all of the other parts that there was a lot of conversation and just trying to parse out the different things. So review summaries is just what it sounds like. So it might, and there's more detail about what each of these means in the document we have. We just don't want to put all of the text on the screen right now. So review summaries could be a summary of the actual reviews or of the process, so like how many reviewers, how many rounds of review. But then when we talk about review reports, that's actually publishing the reviews themselves. And then underneath that, you see that there are options where the authors have to opt in or the reviewers have to opt in so that you are getting permission from the different people involved to publish those. So there are the other categories too, including identities and different types of communications. But basically, we are trying to include anything that happens during the peer review process that could actually be published. So all of these categories aren't mutually exclusive because a journal could publish review reports, communications, and identities, or they might just publish reviewer identities and summaries. So it can be a bit of a mix and match in this one.
Right, right. And last category, Joris, is about has there been any post-publication peer review or commenting? So can you explain why it is called commenting and how does it work?
Yes, this is indeed known as peer review, post-publication peer review. But as there's a confusing term, it really wants to use the word review for the process that goes before that. So the model whereby the editor and the authors and the reviewers work together towards a decision. So everything that happens post-publication we call commenting, again, to avoid this confusion. And we found three models that exist here. That's when, in case post-publication review takes place. So that is by means of registered commenters. In this case, for example, the reviewers, before they can make comments on the published article, have to register, for example, via ORCID. There are cases whereby the commenters are unregistered. Basically, everybody can comment on published articles. This can be masked, or it can be, the identities can be visible. And it can be the cases, which we found, whereby the editor selects the commenter. So basically, based on the invitation by the editor, post-publication comments on the published article can be made. Now, in case these models are being used, then we recommend the publishers to clarify what they mean exactly. For example, what does registration mean by ORCID? This is something that the publisher should specify.
Okay, so this is basically in summary what the taxonomy document entails in terms of 4 different categories. Joris, what is the correct way of using taxonomy? Let's say from now on journals are going to use it. How best they can use it? Can you give us some examples? Yeah,
so as we started the discussion, the project first of all is creating a taxonomy, creating a shared terminology to discuss and describe peer review processes, but it also gives recommendations on how it should be used. And there are basically 2 important use cases. First of all, when an author goes to a journal and considers to submit a manuscript, the author should know really what they can expect when they submit a manuscript. So communication to author, so that the author also can compare the different models when they make a decision on where to submit a manuscript. The second use case is on the published article. So we want to make it very clear to in light of transparency, when somebody reads an article, he or she should really know what kind of review model was applied when they read the article. So let's first look at the first case. So that is information supplied to the publisher about the review models being used. And this is, in short, how we recommend to use it. Basically describing the 4 different categories: identity, transparency, single blind, review interacts with editor, review information published, none. This is the traditional model that you would see. This is how we would describe the traditional review model. However, in a more interactive model, the description will be something like this. So, description of the review model, identity, transparency, single blind. The reviewer interacts, in this case, with the editor and other reviewers. So it's a more collaborative model that we described earlier. The review information published, for example, the review reports and review identities are being published. That's of course important for everybody involved to know before they submit a manuscript to a journal. And in case there's post-publication commenting, the description would be, for example, unregistered commenters. So that people know when they submit a manuscript that they can expect that post-publication commenting, or as you used to call it, review, can take place on their published article. Now, so in other words, there are 2 use cases that is part of this taxonomy we developed. And in this table, and again, we will not go through it in detail, but in the document that we will that is published today, and you can find, and we provide a link later on, it has a description on what part of the taxonomy is published where and to whom. So, for example, identity transparency, that's something that should be communicated to the authors on, for example, the guide for authors, but it should also be published on the article page so that the reader knows what kind of model was being used here. The same with reviewer interacts with. And when we talk about review information published and post-publication commenting, that also should be published to the author in light of transparency. It's not, however, it says here not needed to display policy because, again, if it's published on the article page, it's not necessary to also publish the policy because the information is already
it's already available.
At the same time, it's not just the part of the recommendation of this working group is not only to describe the review model, but actually more information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're also encouraging that for more transparency, key dates like date of submission, date of acceptance, things like that. Just, descriptive information about the review process, just like number of revision, but also if there are technical tools to like authenticate for plagiarism checks, like other things like that. There's more and more are popping up every year to help editors and authors and reviewers with, statistics and reproducibility checks, image manipulations. And so we just want that out there, known that it's been used by the journal.
Fantastic. So, Louis, where is this taxonomy document?
So we have it on OSF, so the link is here, and we are going to be asking for comments. If you look at the image that's up right now, there's a little tiny blue bubble in the top right-hand corner of the screen. So you do have to register to comment, but please comment. And so are we going to be able to send out this link, Joris, after this?
Yes, we will.
Okay, great. So the PDF is available on this OSF link.
So everyone on the call and out there, we are inviting you to please go to this OSF site and read the document and give us your impression and feedbacks. Joris, what are the timelines? Till when is this document available and what's the next steps?
Yeah, so as mentioned before, we started this project earlier. So we started in December. The first draft is what you've seen here today. So we have a public consultation phase for 2 months. So you are invited to read the documents, to have a look at it and provide us your comments. This will close in the mid of August. Then the working group will look at your comments and suggestions, and we will have an updated taxonomy based on your feedback, which we will present during the peer review week, which starts in the week of September 21st. I think the theme of this year is trust in peer review, which is I think very much related to what we aim to achieve with this taxonomy, bringing more trust and transparency in the peer review process and bringing clarity here. And then we have a small window for some last changes based on feedback. And then we start, we have the publication of the final taxonomy by the end of September. And then, of course, the important work starts, because for this to be successful, this has to be widely supported in their ecosystem, which means that the publishers should use this when they communicate the peer review process, but the publishers should also start publishing the peer review on the article page, but also that we start interacting with funders, with policymakers, etc., and also hopefully start to expand this taxonomy again, bringing transparency, which is so important in open science, also to other objects.
Right, fantastic. I think with that, we could thank you both, Joris and Louis, for explaining all the details of the taxonomy, first draft of the taxonomy, and invite everyone to try the link and provide us with their feedbacks. I'm looking into the chat box, and I invite everyone to add their questions over there. I see that already there are a few questions. For example, James is asking whether the format is suitable for machine learning and also like AI for reading through the article pages, for example, or guide for authors, and understand if these things are mentioned over there. Is this something that we have an answer for now, Joris, Louis, or is this a good point to mention, like, this is what exactly we want from the community to comment on the document itself?
No, I think it's a very good point, and it's also something we discussed. And yes, definitely we want this information to be aggregated, and yes, we want this, for example, to provide this information, for example, to third-party sources that collect information about review. So it's a good reminder. Definitely, that's on the agenda, and we'll make sure indeed that the information on the guide for authors, but also on the article pages, is machine readable and accessible to third parties as much as possible.
There is another question about diversity and inclusion. So, of course, it's a hot topic nowadays, given the situation in the US particularly. So there are journals working on looking into, for example, their guide for authors and see how inclusive the language is there and what they can do in order to invite authors to use an inclusive language. But then there is a question on the chat box from Vicky saying, so is there any way to think about blinding in that term? So it seems that blind, double blind, single blind might not be the most inclusive way of saying this.
Yeah, so I can jump in and talk about that a little bit. So that is a very good point. Thank you. We did talk about that quite a lot in the work group because some of us, got a lot of feedback on that. And so when we talked about it, others in their experiences hadn't run into it before, so we didn't know if it was a smaller concern. Not smaller in terms of diversity, but just like, is this something that's going to confuse a taxonomy? Some fields apparently run into the discussion more than others, and so we decided that we liked the idea of following what the field is doing and putting this out there. And part of it was, okay, if we put this out there, what comments will we get about that? So yes, please, for the taxonomy, put the comments in there, share your viewpoints on it, because it was something that we discussed quite a lot, actually.
Gayatri is asking whether the case where some journals allow for commentary, so it's kind of an article type, I guess, that people can comment on already published articles in the same issue in a commentary format. Would this be considered as post-publication commenting, Joris?
Could you repeat the description?
Yes. So the question is that in some cases journals allow commentary on published articles. Would this fall into the post-publication commenting taxonomy?
Yes, indeed. I think that's typical a case where this taxonomy applies. Absolutely.
And Melissa is asking, JATS4R recommendation for published peer review materials working group has been also looking into recommendations in creating standards for publishing peer review reports. So maybe there is some something that these two groups can look into and see if there are any collaboration possibilities in between the two.
Yeah, maybe if I can comment on that.
Right.
I think we started the talk also by stressing how important collaboration is in this field, and this is a first step, but it's also a step whereby we really hope to work with a lot of different organizations, as we already have done. So, for example, making the information machine readable, or making it accessible in other platforms, or allowing services that allow people to compare journal practices. I think we all have to work together. So we see this not as an isolated initiative. Yes, I think that's a really good example of initiative where we invite people to come to us and work together.
Alex is asking, do we have any insights on how many journals would fit into the taxonomy that we created? I don't. I mean, we didn't count the number of journals, but I think, as Luis mentioned, we think that we are covering almost 98% of all the journals in different ways and models that they are using. But Alex, if you see anything that needs to be fit into this taxonomy document, please, Joris is going to share the link at the end as well. And please go and check and add your comments or the exceptions that you don't see fit in the document.
I was just going to say, again, this is the first draft, and we did consult with a lot of people and organizations, but if there's something that is missing, like a large chunk of journals, then we definitely want to be aware of it.
Definitely. Nicola is asking, have there been any consultation with researchers, Joris?
Well, let's first of all stress that the review models that we collected is something we did by looking at existing practices. So we did an analysis, first of all, of the journals. So we have many organizations and publishers that are part of the working group. So they did their research and looked at existing models, but also we looked at literature of articles describing the different review models that are available. So in that sense, what we basically did is collect the information of practices that are already part of the research ecosystem. And second, I would say that the need for transparency and the need to compare different models is definitely something that we hear is a very big topic. We all know the importance of open science, of transparency. We also hear clearly that peer review should be an important element of that. So this, I would say, actually this project is really a reflection of that. It's the need for transparency within the open science movement and bringing that to the peer review process.
Absolutely, I can second that. Joan is asking, well, in some journals we have also letter to editor as an article type. So when an article is published and then a group or a researcher thinks that there is something in the article that needs extra attention, then they can basically comment or post-publishing peer review it by writing a letter to editor. Would that fit into the post-publication commenting in our taxonomy?
Shall I? Yeah, so I think that's also something that we discussed lengthily in the working group.
Yes.
And so we decided not to. We said that the post-publication commenting and the review really applies to the article itself and is really tied to that article. Whatever happens after publication, so if there's an article, a letter to the editor about a specific manuscript being published before, we don't call that peer review. Because you could also argue that citations or references to articles in new publications should also then call the review. So we also made a clear distinction of what we call review and not review. So to make a long answer short, no, we don't consider that peer review of that particular manuscript.
But Joan, this is the first draft, so if you have strong opinions about it, feel free to go and comment on the OSF article.
Indeed, it was a lengthy discussion. So,
Andrea is asking whether the quality check discussed within this group. So how will we check the correctness of peer reviewing? I think this is beyond the scope of this working group, but correct me if I'm wrong, Joris.
Yes, indeed, that is beyond the scope. So the focus here is to bring transparency to the process, to the author community, and to the readers. Yeah. So, but the quality itself, indeed. So we hope, of course, indirectly, this has really greatly improved the quality. By transparency, of course, creates quality, but it doesn't directly go into that. And also because it's very hard to define.
Right. Stan is asking regarding plagiarism, reference checking, and image manipulation checking tools. Wouldn't this endorse particular proprietary softwares? I myself don't think that would be an issue. It's not about endorsing, it's about being transparent about the tool that has been used. This tool can be used by different groups. I mean, for example, plagiarism check is something that is available through Crossref, so there is nothing that we need to hide about it, nor for any other tools that are being used for these kind of checks. It's good, and it's I think a best practice to be transparent about whatever tool that is being used. But if Louis and Joris have any comments on that.
Yeah, I guess on one hand, like a publisher could say, like, we used this type of tool, and then not name it. But then if there are major differences between the tools, then the audiences don't really know what was used. So, I mean, I think I'd be interested to see like how people comment on this, like which way, because I can see an argument in either side. But I kind of lean more toward the transparency of just saying what was used, even if it does look like, you know, you're using it, but not necessarily endorsing it. I would want that information.
I agree.
Well, just sorry to butt in regarding my question, just to make it a little clearer. Is it enough to just display "we check" for plagiarism and not name the tool?
Ah, that's a very good point. I think that is typically something we should think about. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And again, I don't want to answer it because I think it's part of the community decided and of course a working group. But I think it's a good point we will definitely think about. Yeah.
Fantastic. And in the meantime, my internet connection dropped and I am not able to see anything in the chat box anymore. So maybe Louis, you can take over and check the questions on the chat box.
Yeah, sure.
Thank
I'm
you.
not 100% sure where we left off. I was kind of looking around seeing if we were covering everything, but okay. Let's see.
I think I was at the point of James' question about IRI.
Okay. Is there an expectation to create an IRI for the terms and providing labels in multiple languages? I don't think we had really talked about that so far, right?
No, we didn't. No.
So not yet discussed, but you know, good point, good thing to think about and comment on. Another one is, although it's difficult to look into the future with a crystal ball, did we, you know, future-proof any of this when we were thinking about the taxonomy?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think that we should see this as a dynamic project. Peer review changes, so that's why also this project and the taxonomy and the terminology should change. And part of the next step is also to think about a form where we can continue this work. And maybe have a regular yearly checkup, and we do an analysis like we have done last half year to see what is available and see whether we need adaptation. And again, that counts for reviewing new objects, but also whether new models are being introduced that should be included in this taxonomy.
I think we had a similar question before, but this is a little more specific. Have we thought about whether a whistleblower policy might be needed to enable reporting of journals and publishers that are not compliant? So I think this was mentioned before, but generally out of scope for this project, right?
Yep.
Yeah, in a way, the transparency doesn't work by itself, because if we expect and we hope, of course, a part of the ambition is that all journals will publish this information. If journals don't do it, then it's by itself a sign, of course, that they're not being transparent. So in a way, the transparency is the quality check.
Mm-hmm. This is a good point about single blind peer review. So somebody, Joan said that it needs a qualifier for journals that allow peer reviewers to sign their reviews if they wish. I remember discussing this at some point. Do either of you remember where we ended up in discussing reviewers who sign their reviews, even if the policy is generally that they don't.
So this is a part we talked about opt-ins and opt-outs, isn't
Yes.
it? Yeah. So it's in the third pillar of the document. I see Joan is shaking her head.
No, I think it is. Yeah, indeed. So the option.
In the third pillar, you're referring to the reviews being published, not the reviewer's name being passed to the author. That's in column 1. That's in your first pillar.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, so there are two things. So there is the interaction, and in the interaction, actually, we leave it open whether the identities are masked or they're visible. And the third column is indeed the information we provide to the general public, indeed. Yeah. So we don't make a distinction between, but then we talked about it, but then the model will be overcomplicated. So in the interactive models we describe in the second column, it can be that the identities are masked or open. We didn't make a specific category for that. But of course, yeah. So and again, that's a compromise we had to make in order not to make it overcomplicated.
But Joan, you really need to go and comment
yes,
on the document.
You might not necessarily agree with it. So yes, please.
We need your comments on there.
And that could end up being one of those things that if it's, not hitting the 98%, or if it is, because I know we have some journals where it's not typically revealed, but reviewers can be like, I feel strongly about this. And so that could even be on the journal page, like in terms of this is a policy, but if reviewers wish to do this. So I think there's some room in there, but even if not in the taxonomy right now.
It's a webinar, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me check something. Are you seeing any more gaps? Because I'm seeing some.
I see some people have unmuted their mics, and that's a little bit disturbing for this discussion.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there was a question from Kim that was interesting. In thinking about who the reviewer interacts with, how should journals who use in-house editorial teams work with the terms offered? Was that something we had discussed?
I didn't recall having like internal best practices within the editorial offices. I think this is something that journals need to organize themselves. Unless Joris and you, Lois, have a different opinion on that.
Well, it relates to the question. So sometimes there is no editor. For example, when reviewers are invited, sometimes it's done by an editor, somebody is done in-house by the publisher. And we basically group those two together. There's also the question, what is an editor, right? Yeah. So we made it very clear when we talk about editor, we talk about handling editor. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but we try to indeed to address some of the ambiguity around those terms.
Let's see. Interesting. Is there minimal requirements for qualification of reviewers that should be mentioned, such as number of publications, impact factor, or citations? So basically, information about the people reviewing.
Yeah, if I can maybe comment on that, I think that those are would be a very interesting development, but we don't see it part of our scope. Our scope is to bring in transparency in the communication around the review models to the authors and to the readers. Our goal is not necessarily to experiment with new review models, let alone to make those standard. So I think it's a very interesting point. I think we encourage, of course, publishers to experiment with it, but we don't see it part of the scope to introduce it. Of course, if a significant number of journals will start that, then we will follow and include it in our taxonomy.
Yeah, it's a living document at the end of the day. I'm helping you, Lois, by moving from the bottom of the chat box because I can see the latest questions.
Yeah, mine shifted a little, so I was going back to see which ones I missed. I was going to say we've gotten a couple questions about the documents. We will be sending the OSF link at the end of this, so you don't have to worry about that.
Yep.
There was a question by Michael, and it's about adding a category regarding the decision-making. So who is the decision-making person in the journal? Joris, you just mentioned about the difference between handling editor and editor-in-chief. Is this something that we want to have in our taxonomy?
It's a very interesting point. It's not something that we included. the decision we assume to be in the hands of the handling editor. So all the models are implied at. We didn't encounter a lot of models that deviate from that model. If that's the case, if there's really a category of review whereby the decision is, of course, we have the models whereby there's a joint decision or at least a collaboration, interaction between more participants, like the reviewer and the authors and the editor, come to a joint decision. But the decision itself, we didn't put into a category. And again, because we didn't feel there are a substantial number of journals that have that model. Indeed, again, if that's the case, and we would love to hear those, because then we will certainly consider to include it in the taxonomy.
Michael, you have to go and read the document and comment on it. We need your comments. Okay, Kim, yes, Kim is also agreeing. So Kim, you also need to go to the document and comment on it. Kim, Michael, Joan, you have so much experience on these things, and definitely your comments will be very much appreciated. There is another question from Sevalina, and it is about reviewing a letter to editor. So should it be recommended if its publication depends on editor's decision, or it requires also review? Sometimes if it is submitted to an expert in the field, it may be difficult to be found a competent reviewer. I think it's not really related to the taxonomy itself, but if there is anything that the taxonomy can help, it would be about whatever the document article type, the peer review process around it should be available to author and the reader at the end. So I don't think this would be in the scope of our document. All right, I think we have almost covered everything, and we are at 3:45. So we did it in three-quarters of an hour. Thank you very much, everyone, for your great questions and joining the call. And thank you, Louis. Thank you, Joris. And we are looking forward to receiving all your comments on the document.
Yeah,
Thank you, everyone.
Here you find the information about where you can find the documents, but also the STM website where you can find more information about this project. Send me questions directly can also be, and I will discuss it with the working group. And again, we will send an email after the webinar with a link with these links included as well.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.